Hi there, welcome to Unit 6 on the topic of protozoa, organisms that move through soil and consume bacteria in particular, and are very heavily involved and essential in nutrient cycling. Protozoa fit into the grouping of organisms called protists. So today I'll introduce you to this group of organisms that dwell in soils that are called protists, and will particularly focus also on the protozoa within that group. We'll talk about the role of protists in the soil food web, as well as define the difference between protists and protozoa and how protozoa fit into the protists. We'll introduce the 4 groups of protozoa that we'll be focusing on in the unit and start talking about how they acquire nutrients. So by being predatory, they feed on bacteria, and this is what we are interested in terms of nutrient cycling in the soil to the plant. Okay, let's jump into it. So this is our soil food web diagram, just to remind us where we're at in terms of our soil food web organism context, and just to remind us about how the nutrient cycling occurs in the soil food web. So we've got this plant photosynthesizing via the sun and receiving carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and it draws down its carbon through its root system. It is oftentimes connected to symbiotic fungi and the organic residues that the plant drops, as well as the compounds coming from the roots and the dead root material, get decomposed by fungi and bacteria. So the saprotrophic fungi and bacteria. Sometimes there will be a root-feeding nematode. It's like a primary consumer of that plant. And then the bacteria and the fungi have so much nutrients that they gain from the soil matrix as well as the plant residues that they themselves must first be consumed before any of those nutrients are released and cycled back to the plant so that the plant can even receive them. These 2 groups of organisms are what takes on the nutrients from the soil matrix. They're the only 2 groups of organisms that can actually gain minerals from the soil, from the rocks, from the sand, from the silt, from the clay, and put those into their bodies. Then these guys must be consumed in order for those nutrients to be released and provided to the plant. So the group we're looking at today are the protozoa, or the protists, and these are the unicellular organisms in the soil that are a little bit bigger than the bacteria and the fungi, particularly bacteria, which they feed on. So the protozoa are key in nutrient cycling in terms of consuming these bacteria and then releasing the excess nutrients that they gain from this bacteria that they themselves do not need. And those nutrients become plant available. They transform them or mineralize them into plant available form. So this is the group we're looking at in this unit, in Unit 6. And we'll talk about these organisms in detail. So protozoa fit into the group of organisms called protists. Now, protists are not related to one another. They are all the organisms that have been placed in this group that are not animals, are not fungi, and are not plants. So anything else is just placed into this group called protists. The one thing that they do all have in common, even though mostly they're completely unrelated, is that they are eukaryotes. And what that means is that they have a nucleus and linear chromosomes, as well as membrane-bound organelles. So all of the structures inside the cells of these organisms, which are called organelles, and they're the different parts of the cell that perform various functions, that they are bound by membranes. So that's the only commonality these organisms have. That's why here in the photo you can see that red and brown algae. This is kelp here. They are lumped in this group. Photoautotrophic protists, like all the different various types of algae, including the unicellular diatoms. They're all lumped in this group as well. slime molds. So they were lumped in fungi before, but they are actually made up, these structures are made up of amoebae, and we'll talk about amoebae very soon because they're part of the protozoa that we want to deal with in the soil context. But basically, amoebae come together, they live unicellularly as a single organism that is unicellular, so just one cell like this, living singularly as singles and then coming together to actually reproduce, to sporulate. They somehow get together and create these incredible structures we call slime molds. This is a fascinating group of organisms to study and to understand their function in ecosystem and how they behave. So that's slime molds. We also have fungi-like protists. So these are oomycetes, and they are often called water molds. And once again, they're not fungi. They look like fungi under the microscope, as in they're tubular, they have hyphal-like growth, but they also have a motile spore that can move around and be like a little zooming flagellate, which is pictured here. This is a giardia. So this is a flagellate, and it's got these flagella, so these propelling extensions that allows these organisms to move, and their spores actually resemble those. So they are in the protists group, but they are neither fungi nor protozoa. And a lot of these oomycete type of organisms actually cause lots of diseases in plants. So they can become pathogenic when the conditions are right, particularly when the soil is anaerobic, and they will produce a lot of wipeouts of agricultural crops. So protists can be mutualistic, where they live in symbiotic relationships and both the host and the protist can benefit from this relationship. Others are parasitic, so they actually cause diseases, like I think this is a parasitic amoeba. And they're in relationship with animals, plants, fungi, and other protists. They also can be ectosymbiotic, meaning living outside of some other organism and being attached to it, or endosymbiotic, living inside another organism, and also can have symbionts inside of them. So, for example, bacteria can be engulfed and live inside certain protists, as well as algae can be consumed and actually photosynthesize, for example, in different types of protozoa, such as ciliates or amoebae. So it's all very confusing because there are two different terms, protists versus protozoa. Protists are all the organisms that are not related to animals, fungi, or plants, and they're also not related to each other in any shape or form, and often can be quite distant, but they have been put into this protist group. So this diagram depicts where protists fit into the tree of eukaryotic life. And the groups that protists do not belong in terms of relationship to one another, are the animals, the fungi, and plants. Everything else, including algae, is basically a protist of one kind or another. So you can see that everything that is actually in brown, all the different groups of organisms that are in brown, are actually soil protists. So they exist in soil. So soil has the largest diversity of organisms because most of them are still unknown, and the microscopic protists that live in soils are of giant diversity. So the groups we'll talk about mainly are the ciliates, the amoebae, and the flagellates. There are also some others as well that live in soil, but these are the main ones that we'll be concerned with, as these are visible when we do microscopy of soil, and they're the ones that are most important in terms of nutrient cycling. That means consuming bacteria and transforming and releasing those nutrients for plant availability. So this beautiful tree of life you can view in this excellent paper on protists, Soil Protists, a Fertile Frontier in Soil Biology Research. So I highly recommend reading this, as a lot of this unit is actually based on the understanding from that review as to the role of protozoa and other protists in soil ecology and therefore soil restoration. And the sizes of these organisms vary because there are pico-eukaryotic taxa that are smaller than many bacteria. There is a 1 micrometer marine alga called Ostreococcus toweri, but there are also large single-celled protists greater than 20 centimeters that live in the ocean called xenophyophorus. But most taxa are between 5 and 200 micrometers. And just a reminder that a micrometer is 1/1,000,000th of a meter. So it's tiny. You need a microscope to see 1 micrometer, and that's what we usually see, these tiny little specks under 400 times magnification, and these are bacteria, and they're normally about 1 micron in diameter. So as we can see in this tree of life of the eukaryotes, of all the relatedness between all the different taxa of eukaryotes, you can see the proportions designated by these little images on the side of all the protists. And we know that the animals and the fungi and the plants only contribute a small proportion of eukaryotic diversity, so the rest is all protists. So, given the sheer proportion of the known taxa that are protists out of all the eukaryotes, it is no wonder that 80% of eukaryotes that are still unknown are actually protists. So we know so little about these organisms, it's not funny. Now, the protozoa are grouped as part of the protists, but they have this name protozoa because initially scientists saw these organisms move under the microscope and they thought that they are like animals because they move. So the definition of protozoa still remained, even though lots of scientists are very unhappy about this grouping, and there's a lot of debate as to how these organisms need to be grouped. And this word protozoa is not something that's kind of scientifically correct, but for the purpose of actually understanding what these organisms are and using that same classification of these unrelated organisms, we will continue with this beautiful word protozoa. I actually really enjoy this word. But basically, proto means prototype, like first, and zoa means animal. So first animal, a prototype animal. And it just means that it's this basic animal, a unicellular organism that is a whole animal, but it just has one cell. And because it's motile and heterotrophic, so that means it feeds on organic matter or other organisms, so on organic compounds, that puts it under the grouping of protozoa. These organisms include flagellates, ciliates, naked and testate amoebae. And in the image, you can see an amoeba. A naked amoeba, that means it has no shell, whereas a testate amoeba has a shell around it. So we will go through each of those groups of organisms and talk about them in more detail. But all of the organisms we'll speak about in relation to soil belong in this group. These are the 4 different types of protozoa we'll talk about. An interesting fact is that a gram of wet, acidic, nutrient-poor peatland soil can contain 120,000 microalgae, and these are classed as protists, but they photosynthesize. 46,000 testate amoebae, and we'll get into these guys, but these are amoebae with little shells. 28,000 heterotrophic flagellates, and that's one type of protozoa that has these little propellers on them called flagella that allows them to move. And heterotrophic means that it's not photosynthetic, so it eats complex organic compounds just like we do. So we're heterotrophs as well. And 700 ciliates. So these are larger, probably largest out of all of these protozoans. And they've got little cilia or little hair-like projections on their bodies. This is why they are called ciliates. So this is the diversity of protozoa in 1 gram of this peatland soil. So it gives you a scope of how many of these organisms are present in just a gram of soil, potentially. So in soil, the most prominent role of protists or protozoa is nutrient cycling because they release those nutrients from everything they consume. And this comes in many forms. For example, phagotrophy, where a larger protozoa will consume a smaller one. So a lot of ciliates and a lot of amoebae are actually phagotrophic, so they feed by engulfing, by phagocytosis. They actually engulf other organisms, and that's considered a population control. So when there's lots of organisms of particular type, if they're smaller and there are phagotrophic protozoa, they'll consume them and therefore regulate the populations of the smaller ones. A lot of them are symbiotic, and that might include pathogenesis, so parasites of plants, as I mentioned earlier. Some are mutualistic, living together, like the algae living inside different types of protozoa and photosynthesizing, and both partners benefit because the algae are protected and they photosynthesize, so the protozoa benefit by having these algae inside of them. And also some of these protists are parasites of worms, for example, such as nematodes or other different soil organisms. There's also phototrophy, so that's the algae type of protists that can photosynthesize, such as diatoms, for example. And so these photosynthesize, meaning that they fix carbon through the process of photosynthesis. And there's saprotrophy, and these are different types of protists that feed on organic matter, on the debris. They feed on the organic matter directly as it is transformed by bacteria, and also they are capable of transforming that. So these are the saprotrophs with the role of organic matter degradation. The oomycetes fit into the saprotrophic group. So they're normally saprotrophs, but when conditions are correct for them to start consuming the plant, such as anaerobic conditions in the soil, these organisms will invade the plant and start consuming it. So, as I said earlier, lots of plant diseases, crop diseases are associated with oomycetes decomposing these plants. So out of all these soil protists, the protozoa fit into this phagotrophic way of life. So all the soil protozoa that we'll be looking at are actually phagotrophic. And as mentioned earlier, phagotrophic means that these organisms consume other organisms. So they're essentially predatory. And phago means to engulf. The process of phagocytosis is when a cell is able to take in something, another object or another organism, into itself by using its membrane to surround that object or organism. So phagotrophy is basically a term to describe the process of a cell feeding through phagocytosis, using its cell membrane to engulf food particles, and in this case, other organisms. So I've mentioned flagellates. So these are types of flagellates. They've got flagella, so these propelling mechanisms that allows them to move. There are amoebae, so that's an amoeba. And there's testate amoebae, which are not shown in this diagram, but I'll show you some later. So they basically have a shell around them, so they're hidden inside a shell, versus a naked amoeba, which is this one here I'm pointing to now. So they just basically this shape-shifting organism that moves and only has a membrane around it, but no other structure to protect it. There are also amoeboflagellates, so these are protozoa that have flagella, so they have these extensions that allows them to propel at some stages of their life cycle. But many soil flagellates can also form pseudopodia, and these are pseudopodia, so these are the different sort of leg-like extensions that the amoeba can form, and this allows them for this amoeboid movement. So this slow, or sometimes quite quick, but mostly slow transfer of the cytoplasmic contents as these extensions of the pseudopods go across a surface within a liquid. And that's how these guys move. And then there's ciliates as well, and this is a ciliate. So it's got many tiny cilia or little lashes around on its cell, and they're very fascinating organisms as well, and they move very rapidly. And some of them can be very big and some of them can be very small. But normally flagellates in soil are much smaller than the ciliates, and the type of movement that they have, you can tell them apart. We don't want many ciliates in our soil, as these indicate anaerobic conditions forming, so they're a very good bioindicator of what is happening in the soil ecosystem. And you can read more about the soil protists It's a great article to read, actually. It's called Soil Protists, a Fertile Frontier in Soil Biology Research. So a great review on these different types of protists and their function within the soil ecosystem. So we have come to the end of lesson 6.1. And in lesson 6.2, we'll start to focus in more detail on the different groups of protozoa. We'll look at their lifestyle. What are their survival methods? How do they reproduce and disperse? And also how they move. And then we'll move on to how they feed in later lessons. Okay, so you'll be hearing from me in lesson 6.2. Bye for now.